It took a little while for Phil to get over the shock of everything that had gone down in the meeting, but when he did, he decided to strike back. Phil and Bowerman realized that losing the Onitsuka Tiger brand wasn't necessarily the end of the world. In fact, maybe this was an opportunity. They could be so much more than just a distributor. After all, the Cortez, Onitsuka's best-selling shoe, was Bowerman's design. So why couldn't Blue Ribbon just make their own shoes and sell them? Plus, that way, they wouldn't have to keep waiting for shipments to arrive, and they could make as many shoes as they wanted. So, the two co-founders gathered the whole team together and began working on creating their own original shoes, instead of selling Onitsuka's Tiger shoes. But first, they needed a new name. Phil initially wanted to call their new brand Dimension 6, but pretty much nobody else liked that name. And then Jeff Johnson, their first employee, said an idea had suddenly come to him in a dream the previous night. Let's call it Nike. Phil just looked at him blankly and said, "What?" "It's the Greek wing goddess of victory," Johnson explained. Phil thought back to the temple he'd visited whilst travelling. He had to admit, the connection to victory certainly made a lot of sense for a sports brand. But the truth was that Phil himself actually wasn't that keen on the name Nike at first. But the problem was, they were running out of time and had to decide on a name right now, because they needed to start making plans for their new shoe brand as soon as possible. So, left with few other options, Phil agreed to go with the name Nike. Next up, they needed a logo, so they recruited a graphic design student from a nearby university to create it, and she came up with the now iconic swoosh. She got paid just $35 for it. But now that the name and logo were sorted out, there was one more crucial thing they needed to do to really take the fight to Onitsuka. Phil needed a shoe manufacturer who could produce their new high-quality shoes at an affordable price. They already had the design they wanted to use for their first shoe with the Nike logo, which was basically a new version of the popular Cortez, but they had to find the right manufacturer to make it. And all the initial manufacturers they tested seemed to have quality control issues. At a company meeting, Phil told his employees, "Our partnership with Onitsuka is over, and we're completely on our own now. We have this new line we're working on now, which we're calling Nike, but there are big problems with the quality. We're trying to get it fixed, but we don't have much time, so there's no margin for error." Phil looked down the table at the employees in the meeting and realized everyone was slumped in their seats, looking defeated, as if losing their deal with Onitsuka meant the end of Blue Ribbon Sports. Phil realized he needed to inspire his team, and so he pivoted his speech and said, "So, in other words, this is the moment we've been waiting for." Everyone around the table looked up, and Phil continued, "No more selling someone else's brand. Onitsuka has been holding us down for years. Their late deliveries, their mixed up orders, their refusal to hear and implement our design ideas. Let's not look at this as a crisis, let's look at this as our liberation." As Phil stopped speaking, he could sense a wave of relief around the table. The mood had changed after Phil's speech, and the employees felt that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the company at all. They all got to work on how they could make this new Nike brand successful, and how they could partner with the right manufacturers. Although Phil made sure he didn't make the same mistake he'd made with Onitsuka, so rather than committing to just one manufacturer, he established a network of manufacturers which gave him full control over production. That wasn't quite the end of their dealings with Onitsuka though, as they actually sued Blue Ribbon Sports, claiming starting this new Nike brand breached their contract, which stated Blue Ribbon would only sell Tiger shoes. Phil then countersued that Onitsuka had actively been trying to break its exclusivity deal with Blue Ribbon Sports, and in the end, both parties eventually settled and went their separate ways. In 1971, the company Blue Ribbon Sports officially became Nike, and by this point, the company had crossed $1 million in sales per year. And from then onwards, Nike's expansion skyrocketed as they began to grow into the most famous sports brand we know and recognize today. At the 1972 Olympics, Nike featured heavily, giving them a lot of exposure on a global stage. Revenue rapidly rose to $14 million in 1976, and then doubled in just 1 year to $28 million in 1977. Around that time, Phil opened new factories around the world and continued to reinvest everything in more growth. And it was working. Nike was on a huge upswing. They weren't only gaining market share, but they were also fast becoming a fashion statement. However, their success was being envied by a lot of American brands who were watching very closely, waiting for the moment to strike the company down.